The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web. But some threads are not woven by the Force at all. Some are pulled taut by something older, stranger, and infinitely more mischievous than any Jedi philosophy could account for. Lieutenant Monroe had died aboard the Enterprise D, crushed beneath the weight of a warp core breach that never should have happened in the timeline she remembered. One moment there was fire and screaming metal. The next, there was nothing, no pain, no darkness, only a silence so complete it felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence. She hadn't finished writing. Commander Data's ending had been quieter. A single shot meant for Picard, absorbed without hesitation, and then the long fall into whatever came after positronic death. He had calculated the probability of an afterlife for androids at approximately 0. He had been wrong before. Both of them opened their eyes at the same instant. In the same place, the bridge of a starship neither had ever served aboard, though the design was achingly familiar. Sovereign class, by the arc of the consoles and the particular slope of the view screen housing. But the registry plate beside the turbolift read NCC 1701 Q, and no such vessel existed in any fleet record either of them could recall. Well, said a voice from the captain's chair, where no one had been sitting a moment ago. Took you both long enough to notice you were dead. I was beginning to think I'd have to slap you awake. Which, incidentally, I've done before. And it never goes well for the slap party. Hugh lounged with one leg draped over the chair's armrest, wearing a Starfleet uniform 2 ranks above any that existed. Data straightened immediately, cataloging the impossibility. With the same calm he'd once applied to holodeck malfunctions, Monroe's hand went to her hip where a phaser wasn't, and Q clucked his tongue in mock disappointment. No weapons necessary. Not yet, anyway. Not for me. He rose, and the view screen behind him rippled like a stone dropped in water, resolving into a starfield neither officer recognized. Unfamiliar constellations. A galaxy with none of the landmarks either had spent a career navigating by. Data, loyal to the last. Sacrificed yourself for a man who barely remembered your birthday. Monroe, competent, overlooked, dead in a disaster that should have been a footnote. I find footnotes fascinating. No one reads them, but they're often where the truth is hiding. Q Data said, you have brought us back. I've done considerably more than that. My dear android. Q snapped his fingers, and the view screen filled with images, a green-tinged desert world, twin suns, a young woman with dark hair and tired eyes standing in a doorway of sun-baked clay. I've given you a galaxy, an entirely different one. Mind you, one that runs on something they call the Force instead of whatever quantum nonsense your warp cores pretend to understand. And in it, a great many terrible things are about to happen to a great many people who don't deserve them. He walked them through it without mercy, a boy named Anakin Skywalker who would become a monster wearing a mask of black iron, a chancellor named Palpatine who was, in fact, a Sith Lord orchestrating a decade-long war for his own ascension, a republic that would applaud its own execution and call it Order 66. Hugh spoke of cloned soldiers grown in vats on a rain-soaked world, each one carrying a chip in his brainstem designed to make him murder his own generals on command. He spoke of a Trade Federation blockade choking a planet called Naboo, of a queen named Padme Amidala who would one day die of a broken heart that medical science had no name for, of twins separated at birth and hidden like contraband. He spoke with something that almost sounded like genuine disgust, of a Jedi Order so terrified of love that it would rather lose a galaxy than let its knights marry. They call attachment the path to the dark side, Hugh said, as if love itself were the crime, rather than what people do when they're forbidden to feel it honestly. I've watched civilizations rot from less absurd premises. This one's going to lose everything because a room full of monks with laser swords decided that loving someone was a character flaw. Monroe found her voice first. Why us? Why not fix it yourself? Because I'm bored, and because rules are rules. Even mine. Hugh's grin sharpened. I don't do the fixing. I do the giving. And I'm giving you this ship, this crew of 2, and a destination. The view screen shifted again, the same desert world. Closer now, a small house on the edge of a slave settlement. Tatooine. There's a woman there who's about to lose her son to the very Republic. I just described, and a boy who's about to lose his mother to grief he doesn't yet understand he'll spend his whole life running from. You're going to change that. Or you're going to fail spectacularly, and I'm going to enjoy watching. Either way, it's marvelous television. Data absorbed this with the particular stillness he reserved for decisions that mattered. And if we refuse, you won't. Hugh's smile softened, just slightly, into something almost sincere. You never do. That's rather the whole point of you, isn't it, Commander? Buckle up. This is going to be fascinating. If you want to see more characters, enter the Star Wars galaxy. The starfield on the view screen dissolved into something more intimate, star charts, overlaid with faces, names, dates that meant nothing to either officer yet, but would. Hugh promised, come to mean everything. He walked the length of the bridge like a professor pacing a lecture hall. And for the first time since waking, Monroe understood that whatever game Q was playing, he intended for them to actually win it. Sit, Q said, gesturing at the command chairs as though they'd always belonged there. This next part requires context, and context requires patience, a virtue neither of you were famous for. Data lowered himself into the seat nearest the helm, hands folded with the precision of a man or android prepared to receive data and retain all of it. Monroe remained standing a moment longer before relenting, arms crossed, watching Q the way she'd once watched unstable plasma conduits, with respect and considerable wariness. The galaxy you're entering, Q began, runs on an energy field called the Force. Every living thing generates it. Some beings are born sensitive enough to manipulate it, to move objects, to sense danger before it arrives, to see fragments of the future. The Jedi Order has spent 1,000 generations training such beings to serve peace. The Sith Order has spent just as long training them to seize power. Right now, there are 2 Sith in the entire galaxy, and the Jedi don't know it. That's rather the whole tragedy in one sentence. He detailed the Sith rule of 2, a master and an apprentice. Always hidden, always plotting, and named the master, Darth Sidious, a shadow puppeteer who wore, in public, the face of a mild and unassuming senator named Sheev Palpatine. Hugh explained how Palpatine intended to manufacture a war between the Galactic Republic and a separatist movement. He was also secretly directing how he would use that war to seize emergency powers, how he would end it by having every clone soldier in the Republic's army murder every Jedi general standing beside them in a single coordinated instant, an atrocity called Order 66, triggered by biochips, embedded in every clone's brainstem. During gestation on the cold, rain-drenched cloning world of Kamino, the clones are grown from a bounty hunter named Jango Fett. Hugh continued, good man, in his own violent way. His genetic template will be handed to a shadowy separatist named Count Dooku, once a Jedi himself, now Sidious's apprentice. Though he doesn't know he's disposable, Dooku will work alongside a Trade Federation viceroy and a droid general named Grievous, and together they'll manufacture a war that exists for exactly one purpose: to kill Jedi and consolidate Palpatine's power. Monroe's jaw tightened, and nobody in this republic notices any of this. Everybody's too busy arguing about trade regulations and committee jurisdiction to notice the man quietly disassembling their government from the inside. Sound familiar? Hugh's tone was light, but something colder moved beneath it. There's a girl on Naboo right now, Queen Padme Amidala, all of 14, forced to lead her people against a Trade Federation blockade that Sidious himself engineered as the opening move. She'll survive it. She'll grow into one of the finest political minds this galaxy produces. She'll fall in love with a boy from Tatooine, marry him in secret because the Jedi Order forbids their own from having families, and die on a hospital table 19 years from now, ostensibly of a broken heart. Actually, because a Sith Lord choked the will to live out of her with his bare hands while pretending it was grief. Data's optical sensors narrowed almost imperceptibly, the closest thing to a wince his positronic matrix could produce. That isn't a logical medical outcome. The Force makes room for a logic, Commander. That's rather its charm. Hugh's projection flickered images faster now. A Twi'lek duchess named Satine cries on a world called Mandalore, committed to pacifism in a culture built on war. A Togruta girl named Ahsoka Tano who would be falsely accused of a Crime she didn't commit and abandoned. By the very order that trained her. Twin children, Luke and Leia, who would be split apart at birth and hidden on opposite ends of the galaxy because the alternative was letting Sidious find them. And Anakin, Hugh said, quieter now. 9 years old, enslaved on Tatooine. More powerful in the Force than any being born in 1,000 generations. And about to be discovered by a Jedi named Qui-Gon Jinn, who will die before he can properly train the boy, leaving that responsibility to a Padawan named Obi-Wan Kenobi who never wanted it. Anakin will grow up worshipped as prophecy and starved of the one thing he actually needs, which is to be told he's allowed to love people without it destroying him. The Jedi will fail him, not maliciously, just completely. He let the silence stretch long enough for both officers to feel its weight. So here's my gift. Hugh snapped his fingers, and the uniforms both officers wore shimmered and reformed. Starfleet grays and blacks. But the pips at their collars rearranged themselves. Data's sleeve now bore captain stripes. Monroe's, commanders. Data, you'll captain this vessel. Monroe, first officer. There will be 2 more joining you shortly, and you'll need to build the rest of your crew from people you trust, because I am generous, not thorough. I don't do middle management. You said 2 more, Monroe said. A mother, Hugh said, and her son. I'd start rehearsing what you're going to say to a woman about to be told her child's future involves genocide, war, and a black iron mask if I were you. Though I suppose you have some experience with impossible conversations. Comes with the uniform. He gestured toward the view screen, where the desert world grew larger, closer. Twin suns burning gold over dunes the color of rust. Tatooine's waiting. So is she. The Enterprise Q broke through Tatooine's thin atmosphere without so much as a shudder. Its inertial dampeners rendering the descent silent and smooth in a way that would have looked, to anyone watching from the ground, like a second sun falling out of the sky and refusing to crash. Shmi Skywalker was hanging laundry behind Watto's shop when the shadow crossed her yard. She looked up, expecting a transport ship or a sandstorm, and instead found herself staring at something the size of a small city descending toward the settlement's outskirts. With no engine roar, no dust plume, nothing but an impossible hush and a hull that gleamed like polished durasteel under twin suns. By the time the ship settled, hovering, somehow, a meter above the sand, rather than resting on it, half of Anakin's neighbors had come out to stare. Shmi had not. She was already walking toward it, laundry forgotten, because 17 years of slavery had taught her that when something this strange arrived without warning, it was either about to save her or about to end her, and she'd rather know which. A hatch opened where no hatch had been visible a moment before. Data stepped out first, followed by Monroe, both still in Starfleet uniform, both moving with the careful, deliberate calm of people who understood exactly how alarming they appeared and were, trying not to compound it. Shmi Skywalker, Data said. His voice carried across the sand with unnatural clarity. We are not here to harm you or your son. We have been sent by an entity of considerable power, and we carry information that concerns Anakin's future. May we speak with you? Shmi's eyes moved past him to the ship, to the strange insignia on his chest, to the way the vessel didn't so much as ripple the sand beneath it. You're not Republic, she said. Not Hutt, either. What are you? Former Starfleet officers, Monroe offered, then caught herself. That's a long story. The short version is that we've traveled a very great distance, and we know things about your son that you need to hear. Some of it is going to be hard. It was Anakin who broke the standoff, sprinting out from behind Watto's stall with the reckless fearlessness of a 9-year-old who had never once in his life been taught to be afraid of anything except being caught doing something forbidden. He skidded to a stop in front of the ship, craning his neck up at the hull, eyes wide with the specific hunger of a boy who dreamed of pod engines and hyperdrives and had built a protocol droid out of scrap parts in his spare time. That's not a ship I've ever seen, he breathed. What's the drive system? Is that a warp field? I read about theoretical faster-than-light drives that don't use hyperspace lanes, but nobody's ever actually. Annie, Shmi said, gently, though her eyes never left Data. Inside, Hugh chose that moment to appear, sitting cross-legged in midair beside the ship's hatch as though he'd been there the entire time, which In a sense, he had. Shmi startled backward. Anakin didn't move at all, too fascinated to be frightened. Shmi Skywalker, Hugh said, sweeping into a bow that accomplished nothing but mockery. I have watched a great many mothers in a great many galaxies love their children imperfectly, desperately, and completely. Yours is one of the finer examples, which is why I'm here to make you an offer most parents would kill for. And some, frankly, have. I don't want an offer, Shmi said. I want to know why a ship the size of a moon is parked outside my house. Fair. Direct. I like that. Hugh floated down until his boots touched sand. Your son is going to become the most powerful being this galaxy has ever produced. He is also, in the timeline I've just erased, going to become a monster, a Sith Lord in black iron, responsible for the deaths of thousands, including, eventually, nearly everyone he loves. The Jedi Order will find him in a matter of weeks. They'll take him from you, train him half-heartedly, fail to teach him how to love without fear, and hand him directly to the man engineering his downfall. Shmi's hand found Anakin's shoulder and gripped it hard enough that he winced. You're lying. I never lie. I simply arrange truth for maximum dramatic effect. Hugh's expression sobered. Just slightly. I'm offering you a different ending. A ship, a crew, a rank. Your son grows up under people who will actually tell him the truth about his own power instead of wrapping it in dogma and fear. You grow up with him instead of dying alone in a Tuscan camp while he's off learning to hate an order that couldn't save you. The word dying landed like a physical blow. Shmi's breath caught, and for a moment the desert wind was the only sound between them. You want to take him, she said quietly. I want to take both of you, Hugh corrected. Together, captain's authority under Data, there. Counselor and lieutenant commander for you. You understand people better than any Starfleet psych officer I've ever met. And this crew is going to need that badly. Your son gets a commission too, once he's earned it. Nobody takes anybody anywhere they don't choose to go. Anakin looked up at his mother, then at the impossible ship, then at Data, who met the boy's gaze with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and had long since stopped minding. Commander Data, Anakin said, testing the name. You're not human. You're a droid. An android, Data said. A distinction with meaning, though not one I insist upon strangers observing. I understand you built things. I built a protocol droid, and I'm building a pod racer. Anakin's chin lifted, pride cutting through fear. It's the fastest thing on Tatooine. I would very much like to see it, Data said, and meant it. And something in Shmi Skywalker's chest, some final nod of resistance, loosened at the sight of her son, being spoken to like he mattered, rather than like he was a prophecy. She looked at Q one more time. If I say yes, and you're lying to me about any of it, then you'll have lost nothing you weren't already going to lose. Q said, gently, for once without theater. That's the trade, Shmi. I'm not offering you safety. I'm offering you a fighting chance to keep him. That's rarer than you think. Shmi Skywalker looked down at her son's upturned face, at the twin suns burning behind him, and made the only choice a mother in her position could ever make. Get your things, Ani, she said. We're leaving Tatooine. The interior of the Enterprise Q was, to Anakin Skywalker, the single greatest thing he had ever seen, and he had seen a pod race nearly kill 6 competitors in one lap. He moved through the corridors with his hands trailing along the walls, not touching anything he wasn't invited to touch. Shmi had drilled that manners into him since he could walk, but looking at everything with an intensity that made Monroe, walking a half-step behind, think of every brilliant, hungry engineering cadet she'd ever mentored back before her own life had ended, in fire and silence. This metal, Anakin said, running a finger along a bulkhead, seemed so fine it was nearly invisible. It's not durasteel. It doesn't even feel like metal, really. What's the tensile? Duranium and tritanium composite, Monroe said. Though I suspect this particular ship's hull is holding together through means that have very little to do with metallurgy, and a great deal to do with Q's sense of humor. Who's Q, actually? Is he a Jedi? He didn't feel like a Jedi. Obi-Wan Kenobi's master. I heard about him once. Traders talk. Supposedly Jedi have this presence, like static before a storm. Q didn't feel like that. He felt like Anakin's search for the word. Bigger. Wrong-sized. Like something that doesn't fit in the room even when it's standing still. Monroe glanced at him, surprised. That's a remarkably precise description for a 9-year-old. I notice things, Anakin said, without arrogance, simply stating fact the way he might report a pod racer's engine temperature. Mom says it's because I have to. Slaves who don't notice things don't stay alive long. The sentence landed heavier than the boy seemed to intend it, and Monroe found she had nothing adequate to say back to it. So she said nothing at all and let him keep walking. They found Data in the ship's engineering section, one hand resting against an active plasma conduit that by any reasonable safety standard should have taken his hand off at the wrist. He wasn't harmed. Of course, hadn't expected to be, but Anakin's eyes went wide with something between horror and delight. You're not worried about radiation exposure, Anakin said. I am an android, Data replied. My internal systems are shielded against a range of energetic phenomena that would prove fatal to organic tissue. It was, admittedly, an unnecessary demonstration. I found myself curious whether you would ask why, rather than simply assuming I was unafraid because I was foolish. Most people just think I'm too young to understand things, Anakin said. You're the first person who's tested whether I would ask the right question instead. Data considered this with the particular stillness. That meant he was recalibrating something internally. Q informed us of your potential. I confess I found the descriptor imprecise. The most powerful being the galaxy has ever produced tells me nothing about who you actually are, only what you might become. I find the distinction matters considerably more than Q seemed to think it did. Anakin sat down on an equipment crate, suddenly looking younger than his 9 years. All the bravado of the corridor walk draining out of him at once. He said I become a monster. In the other version, the one you're supposed to stop. He did. Do you believe him? It was Monroe who answered, crouching down so she was eye level with the boy. I believe that Q doesn't lie about outcomes, even when he lies about everything else. But I also believe outcomes aren't destiny, Anakin. They're just what happens when nobody intervenes. That's the whole reason we're here. What made me become a monster? In the other version, Anakin's hands had curled into fists on his knees, and Data noted, filed away. The way he filed away every piece of data that might later matter. That the boy's question was not will I, but what made me. An important distinction between fear of a fate and fear of a cause. Fear, Data said simply. According to Q's account, you lost people you loved, and the philosophy meant to guide you. The Jedi orders teaching that attachment leads to suffering and must therefore be abandoned. Gave you no framework for grief. That did not also demand you suppress love itself. A being capable of your reported power, denied honest instruction in how to carry loss, will eventually break in whatever direction offers the least suppression and the most control. The Sith offered you control. That is, I understand, a persuasive offer to someone who has spent his entire recorded existence powerless to protect what matters to him. Anakin was quiet for a long moment. Outside the viewport, Tatooine's twin suns had shrunk to distant points of light as the ship climbed toward the black. I don't want to lose my mom, he said finally, very quietly. Then that will not be permitted to happen, Data said, with a flatness that in a human might have sounded like empty reassurance. But in Data carried the weight of an actual commitment logged and accepted. I do not offer comfort easily, Anakin, because comfort that is not backed by intention is merely noise. I am telling you this because I intend to see it done. Something in the boy's shoulders eased, fractionally. The posture of a child who had been braced for a blow that hadn't landed. Captain, he said, testing the title. That's what Q called you. It is. What's my rank going to be? Lieutenant, Data said. Second officer. Once you've earned the trust of a crew we do not yet have. I would ask, in the meantime, that you consider this vessel your responsibility as much as mine. You asked about the hull's tensile strength a few minutes ago. I suspect you will find engineering more welcoming of your curiosity than any Jedi temple would have been. For the first time since leaving Tatooine, Anakin Skywalker smiled, not the reckless grin of a boy showing off in a pod racer, but something quieter, more startled, like a door opening onto a room he hadn't known existed. Can I see the warp core? He asked. After you have slept, Shmi's voice cut in from the corridor entrance, warm with the specific exasperation of a mother who recognized her sons. expression and knew exactly where it led. It has been a very long day, Ani. Yes, ma'am, Anakin said, and followed her out, glancing back once at Data with the look of a boy filing away a promise for collection later. Data watched him go and turned to find Monroe studying him with an unreadable expression. You made him a promise, she said, that you'd see it done. That's not standard captain's protocol. No, Data agreed. It is not. I find, however, that this particular mission does not lend itself to standard protocol. Hugh has given us a child who will either save this galaxy or end it, and a mother who has already sacrificed everything once to protect him. I do not intend to make either of them regret their trust in us. Monroe allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one since waking on this ship. Welcome to command, Captain. The Enterprise Q dropped out of whatever passed for hyperspace in Q's peculiar cosmology directly above Naboo, and the bridge crew found themselves looking down at a world in the grip of war. Trade Federation battleships hung in low orbit like a ring of iron thorns, their landing craft ferrying wave after wave of battle droids down into the planet cities. Sensor readings scrolled across Monroe's console faster than she could fully parse. Droid transports, blockade cruisers, a control ship the size of a small moon coordinating the entire operation from geosynchronous orbit. That's them, Anakin said, pressed close to the view screen despite Shmi's hand on his shoulder. The Trade Federation. I've heard traders talk about this. They're blockading the planet over trade route taxes. That is the stated justification, Data said, studying the tactical display. Hugh's briefing indicated the true purpose is considerably darker. Viceroy Newt Gunray is acting under instruction from Darth Sidious to invade Naboo and force Queen Amidala to sign a treaty legitimizing the occupation. Her refusal to do so is, by Q's account, precisely what Sidious is counting on. Chaos on Naboo is intended to justify further Senate intervention, which Sidious will manipulate toward his own ascension to Chancellor. So the plan, Monroe said slowly, is to let a 14-year-old queen get invaded so a Sith Lord can use the sympathy vote to become the most powerful man in the Republic. That is, regrettably, an accurate summary. Shmi's arm tightened around Anakin's shoulders. And Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi Q mentioned, already on the surface, Data confirmed, reading the sensor sweep. He and his Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi, were dispatched by the Chancellor to negotiate before the invasion began. Q's account states they escaped the Federation ship, evaded the initial ground assault, and are currently making their way toward the capital, with the Queen and her retinue. Their path will take them through Auto Gunga, then across the planet's core in a Gungan transport, and finally into orbit aboard a damaged royal cruiser they will need to repair mid-flight. That sounds like a lot could go wrong, Monroe said. A great deal already has, in the timeline Q described. Qui-Gon Jinn dies on this planet in approximately 6 days, in a duel with a Sith apprentice named Darth Maul. It is one of the specific outcomes we have been sent here to prevent. Anakin turned from the view screen. Can't we just go get them? Beam them up, like you said the ship can do? We could, Data said. However, Q was explicit in his instructions. We are not to simply erase every obstacle from this galaxy's path. Doing so would deprive its people of their own agency, and worse, would announce our presence and capabilities to every faction watching, including, eventually, Sidious himself, who I suspect would find a starship capable of instantaneous matter transport considerably more alarming than a single Jedi's lightsaber. We must act with precision, not omnipotence. Then what do we do? Anakin pressed. Just watch. No, Monroe said, before Data could answer. We help where the Federation doesn't expect help to come from, and we make sure the parts of this story that need to happen, Padme escaping, the treaty failing, the boy meeting his Jedi, still happen, just without the body count Q described. Data nodded slowly. Precisely stated, Commander. Our first priority is the Trade Federation's droid control ship in orbit. Q indicated that in the original timeline, the invasion's droid army was ultimately deactivated by the destruction of that ship's central control computer, an act accomplished by a young pilot flying a captured N-1 starfighter directly into its reactor core. I would prefer we accomplish the same result without requiring anyone to fly into anything. You can do that from up here? Anakin asked, eyes bright with the specific fascination of a boy who had spent years dreaming about exactly this kind of problem. With sufficient targeting precision, yes. However, the Trade Federation's shields, while primitive by Starfleet standards, are calibrated to a specific frequency band. I will require several minutes to analyze and adapt our phaser arrays accordingly. In the interim, Lieutenant, Data glanced at Anakin, and something in his tone shifted, formal and deliberate. I would value your assistance. Anakin straightened, startled. Me? You have spent years disassembling and reassembling machinery with limited tools and no formal instruction, correct? Yeah. I mean, yes, sir. Then you understand droid systems in a manner that even I, with considerably more raw processing capacity, do not intuitively grasp, because you have learned them from the inside, through trial and failure, rather than from schematics. I would like your assessment of the Federation's droid control architecture. Data pulled up a rotating schematic, salvaged from the ship's passive sensor sweep of a downed Federation scout droid. Specifically, is there a faster method of disabling the network than destroying its central relay? Anakin leaned in, and for the next several minutes, the fear that had been sitting in his chest since Tatine gave way entirely to the singular, focused joy of a genuine engineering problem. He traced power conduits with his finger, muttering half to himself, and Monroe watched Data watching him, patient, unhurried, letting the boy arrive at his own conclusions rather than simply supplying the answer. There, Anakin said finally, jabbing a finger at a secondary node. That's not the main relay, but it's a choke point. Every droid signal routes through it before the central computer processes commands. You don't need to blow up the whole control ship. You just need to overload that junction, and every droid on the planet goes dumb at once, same as if you destroyed the core. Except you don't have to fly a fighter into a moon-sized ship to do it. Data's optical sensors brightened, the android equivalent. Monroe had learned, of genuine surprise. That is an elegant solution, Lieutenant. More elegant than the one originally employed. Anakin flushed with a pride he clearly wasn't used to feeling from adults. And Shmi, watching from the back of the bridge, felt something in her chest. Ease for the first time since the sand of Tatooine had disappeared beneath them. Then let's not disappoint him, Monroe said, already moving to the tactical station. Captain orders. Data rose from the command chair, and for the first time since his revival, something in his posture carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had found, in an impossible galaxy and an unlikely crew, a purpose worth the strange gift of his second life. Take us to firing position, he said. It's time Naboo had a fighting chance. The junction overload took 4 minutes and 11 seconds to execute, and across the surface of Naboo, an entire droid army went still at once, mid-stride, mid-charge, mid-massacre, arms locked, photoreceptors dimming, as if some vast and patient hand had simply lifted its finger off a switch. On the bridge, Anakin let out a whoop of pure vindication that Shmi didn't bother to hush. Federation control ship reports catastrophic network failure. Monroe read off her console, unable to keep the satisfaction out of her voice. They have no idea what hit them. Sensors show their bridge crew in what I can only describe as full panic. Casualties among Naboo's ground forces? Data asked. Minimal. Most of the fighting stopped the instant the droids did. Monroe scanned further, then went still. Captain, I'm reading a life signs anomaly near the Theed Palace. Humanoid, critical condition. In the company of what looks like a Jedi energy signature and a Sith one. Data was already moving. That will be Kagan Jinn. Q indicated the duel with Darth Maul was scheduled to occur following the droid army's deactivation. In the palace hangar, we may be early enough to intervene, or we may already be too late. Lieutenant Anakin, remain on the bridge with your mother. But this is not a request born of doubt in your capability, Data said, already halfway to the turbolift, Monroe falling into step beside him. It is a request born of the fact that the man we are about to save is the Jedi who, in the timeline we are attempting to prevent, first discovered you on this very planet in a matter of days. I would prefer his first encounter with this crew not include watching a child walk into a lightsaber duel. Anakin's jaw tightened, but he stayed. and Shmi's hand found his shoulder in silent gratitude. The transporter deposited Data and Monroe in a service corridor, adjacent to the palace hangar. Phase shifted just enough to avoid immediate detection. Through the archway ahead, the sound reached them first, the distinctive hum and crack of lightsabers. Meeting, a rhythm both officers recognized from Q's briefing without ever having witnessed it themselves. Qui-Gon Jinn was down. Not dead, not yet, but down. One hand pressed to a wound in his side. Green blade raised in a defense that was buying seconds, not minutes, against an opponent whose double-bladed red saber moved with a predatory, tattooed fluidity that made the Jedi Master look, for the first time in his long career, genuinely mortal. Obi-Wan Kenobi was sealed behind a force field partition, hammering uselessly against energy that would not yield, screaming his master's name with a desperation Data filed away with something that, in a human, would have been called grief in advance. Darth Maul's blade came down. Qui-Gon's defense failed by a fraction of a second. Monroe fired first. The phaser bolt, set, per Data's earlier instruction, to heavy stun rather than kill, in keeping with Q's insistence that this galaxy's players be allowed to live out their own reckonings, took Darth Maul square in the chest and threw him backward, into the hangar bulkhead hard, enough to crack durasteel plating. He hit the floor and did not rise, his lightsabers clattering dark and silent across the deck. The silence that followed was absolute. Qui-Gon Jinn stared at the two figures who had appeared, seemingly from nowhere, in uniforms he had never seen and carrying weapons that produced no visible projectile and yet had dropped a Sith Lord in a single shot. He was bleeding, badly, one hand still pressed to his side, but his eyes, sharp, assessing, unmistakably. A duelist's eyes, even in extremity, moved between them with the wary calculation of a man deciding whether he'd traded one danger for another. Who, he managed. Later, Monroe said, already crouching beside him, running a device across the wound that made a soft, rising chime. Internal bleeding, lacerated something. I'm not a doctor, but this reads bad. Captain, I need to get him to sickbay now. Data was already at the force field controls, fingers moving across an interface that had no business being compatible with Republic technology and yet yielded to his touch regardless. A small mercy Q had apparently built into the ship's systems for precisely this kind of moment. The field dropped, and Obi-Wan Kenobi stumbled through, saber still raised, eyes darting between his fallen master, the unconscious Sith, and the two strangers who had apparently just rewritten the outcome of his life. What did you do to him? Obi-Wan demanded, dropping to his knees at Qui-Gon's side, and it wasn't clear whether he meant Maul or his master. Both truths tangled together in the same raw fear. Stun the one trying to kill your master, Data said, evenly. And we intend to save the one who is dying, if you will permit us to move quickly. I understand this requires trust you have no reason to extend. I would ask for it regardless. Qui-Gon's hand found Obi-Wan's wrist, weak but insistent. Let them, he said, voice thin with blood loss. Padawan, let them. There was something in the old Jedi's face as he said it. Not surrender, but a lifetime's trained instinct for recognizing when the Force itself had intervened in ways beyond his understanding, and the wisdom to stop fighting what he could not yet explain. Monroe activated her communicator. Enterprise, 2 to beam directly to sickbay, medical emergency. The last thing Qui-Gon Jinn saw before the transporter took him was Obi-Wan's face, terrified and disbelieving, and the last thing he heard was Darth Maul beginning to stir on the hangar floor behind them, already too late to stop what had just been set irrevocably into motion. Aboard the ship, in sickbay, the Enterprise QS medical systems, technology built for a species with a redundant cardiovascular system and diagnostic tools that had no concept of force healing, went to work on a wound that should have been fatal within the hour. Data stood at the observation window, watching the biobed readouts stabilize by fractions, and allowed himself, for the first time since his revival, something close to satisfaction. He's going to live, Monroe confirmed, emerging from sickbay 20 minutes later, exhaustion and relief warring in her voice. Barely, but he's going to live. Data nodded slowly. Then the timeline has already diverged in ways Q did not fully account for. Kagan Jinn was meant to die on this world. His survival changes everything that follows. Obi-Wan's training. Anakin's discovery. The shape of every choice yet to come. Is that a problem? No, Data said, and something in his voice, quiet and certain, carried the full weight of a captain's conviction. That is precisely the point. Obi-Wan Kenobi did not leave his master's bedside for 3 days. The Enterprise Q had extended a diplomatic offer to Queen. Amidala within hours of the battle's end, quiet, careful, delivered by Monroe and a private audience rather than broadcast to the Federation's retreating remnants or the Republic. Senate's prying attention. The Queen, 14 years old and already possessed of a political instinct that would one day make her one of the galaxy's finest stateswomen, had studied the strange officer with an intensity that reminded Monroe uncomfortably of Anakin. You destroyed the droid control network, Padme Amidala said. In the throne room, Data had insisted on treating with full formal protocol, without a single Naboo or Gungan casualty. That's not Jedi technology. It's not Republic technology either. No, Your Highness, Monroe agreed. It isn't. Then whose is it? Ours, Monroe said simply. We're not aligned with the Republic, the Federation, or anyone currently playing this particular game. We came here because we knew what was coming, and we intend to keep coming, if you'll let us, quietly, and only when the alternative is worse than our interference. Padme's eyes had narrowed, with the wariness of a young queen who had just watched foreign powers invade her world under false pretenses. That is precisely the justification the Trade Federation used. It is, Monroe acknowledged, without flinching from the comparison. The difference, Your Highness, is that we're telling you exactly what we are and exactly what we want, which is nothing from you. No treaties, no trade concessions, no seat at your Senate. We want Kagan Jinn to live, and he's living. We want to find you when it matters again, and we will. Beyond that, your galaxy is yours to run. It was, in the end, Kagan himself, pale, bandaged, propped up in the Enterprise's sick bay and lucid enough to insist on being present, who tipped the balance. Your Highness, he'd said, whatever they are, they saved my life at considerable risk to expose their own existence to forces that would very much like to understand them. I have spent my life reading intention in the Force. Theirs is not malicious. That had been enough. Padme extended a quiet gratitude, no formal alliance. And the Enterprise Q slipped away from Naboo 3 days later with Kagan healed enough to travel and Obi-Wan Kenobi watching the strange ship's departure with an expression that mixed relief, suspicion, and something that would, given time, grow into genuine trust. They did not go far. Q had made it clear that the mission's next phase could not wait. And so the ship set course for a world of endless gray ocean and colder gray rain. Kamino. 100,000 clones, Data said, standing on the bridge. As the platform city of Topoka broke the horizon through curtain after curtain of storm. Perhaps more, by the time the Republic's war begins in earnest. Each one grown to serve. Each one carrying an inhibitor chip embedded during gestation, designed, according to Q's account, to override a clone's free will and compel obedience to a single command, regardless of loyalty, regardless of the relationships built over years of service alongside the Jedi they will one day be ordered to kill. Anakin, standing beside him now with a lieutenant's insignia, freshly earned and worn with visible pride, stared down at the rain-lashed platforms. That's not a weapon. That's slavery with extra steps. An astute comparison, Data said, and likely more accurate than the Republic itself would care to admit. The clones will be told they are soldiers, given ranks, given camaraderie, given every appearance of dignity and choice, while a single line of programming, in their neural architecture, ensures none of it was ever truly theirs to refuse. Monroe's expression had hardened into something Data recognized from her service record, the look of an engineer confronted with a system built to fail the people trusted to operate it. How many chips are we talking about removing? Every clone currently in production or already decanted, Data said. Q's briefing indicates the facility maintains full genetic and neural records for each unit. If we can access the central cloning database and identify the chip's neural signature, It may be possible to disable the command sequence across the entire population, simultaneously rather than performing individual extractions on 100,000 separate patients. That's a significant technical assumption, Monroe said. It is. I would value Lieutenant Skywalker's input on the matter, given his demonstrated aptitude for identifying structural choke points in complex systems. Data glanced at Anakin, whose exhaustion from 3 sleepless nights fell away instantly at the invitation. They beamed down under cover of the storm, materializing in a maintenance corridor deep beneath Topoka City's central spire. Data, Monroe, and Anakin, with Shmi remaining aboard ship at her own quiet insistence, unwilling to leave her son unsupervised in a facility built to manufacture soldiers, but equally unwilling to slow the mission with a protective instinct she knew. Rationally, she needed to temper. The corridor was cold, industrial, humming with the low mechanical drone of incubation systems running at scale. Through a viewport in the nearest wall, rows of clone cylinders stretched into the dim distance, each one holding a curled, dreaming figure at some stage between embryo and soldier. Identical faces by the thousand, waiting to be born into a war they had never chosen and a betrayal encoded into their very bones. Anakin pressed a hand against the transparent steel, and something in his face went very still. They don't know, he said quietly. Any of them. They're going to grow up thinking they chose this. They will believe they chose loyalty, Data said. The chip does not remove choice from their daily lives, only from the single, catastrophic moment Palpatine requires. It is, in its way, a crueler design than outright slavery. It permits the illusion of freedom right up until the instant that illusion is weaponized. Monroe had already found the terminal she was looking for, a research station humming with encrypted Kaminoan architecture, utterly unlike anything in Starfleet's databases, and yet, Anakin discovered within minutes of studying it over her shoulder, built on principles of redundancy and fail-safes he recognized instinctively from years of coaxing broken machinery back to life with nothing but instinct and scavenged parts. There, Anakin said, pointing to a subroutine buried 4 layers deep in the facilities. Neural conditioning protocols. That's not standard behavioral programming. That's a separate command architecture walled off from the rest of the training data. Whoever built this didn't want it showing up in a routine diagnostic. Data's optical sensors fixed on the isolated code. Order 66, he said quietly. You have found it, Lieutenant. Outside, the Kaminoan rain continued to fall, endless and indifferent. Over 100,000 soldiers, who did not yet know that 3 strangers standing in a maintenance corridor beneath their incubation chambers had just found the leash meant to control them, and had every intention of cutting it. The subroutine glowed on the terminal screen, a small and unassuming knot of code responsible for the deaths of countless Jedi not yet born to die. Isolate it, Monroe said. Write a patch that strips the command architecture without touching anything else: motor, function, memory, personality. In and out, clean. That's the problem, Anakin said, not moving to comply. It's not clean. Look at the integration points. He traced a finger along the display, tracing threads of code that spread outward from the isolated subroutine like roots. This isn't bolted on. It's woven into the same neural pathways that handle obedience training, unit cohesion, even basic threat response. If I rip it out wrong, I'm not just removing the kill switch. I could be changing who they are. Monroe frowned. You're saying we can't remove it. I'm saying we shouldn't do it without thinking about what removing it actually means. Anakin's jaw was set in the same stubborn line. Data had already learned to associate with the boy's most important arguments. Hugh said the Jedi Order's whole problem is deciding what's best for people without asking them. Isn't that exactly what we're doing right now? 100,000 people, and none of them get a vote. They're not people yet, Monroe said, more sharply than she intended. Most of these units haven't even been decanted. They're embryos in tanks. There's no one to ask. Not now, but there will be. And when there is, they're going to find out. Somebody reached into their heads before they were even born and decided what kind of choice they were allowed to have, even if it's the choice not to murder people they love. Anakin's voice cracked slightly, and Data noted. with the part of his positronic matrix that had spent years studying human grief, that the boy was not really talking about the clones at all. That's not so different from a chip that makes you kill your friends. It's just a chip that makes you not able to. The corridor went quiet, except for the hum of the incubation systems and the relentless patter of rain against the spire far above them. Lieutenant makes a valid point, Data said finally. Consider the alternative framing. If we remove the command architecture entirely, without their consent, we are not liberating them. We are simply substituting our judgment for Palpatine's, however benevolent our intention. That is a philosophically uncomfortable position for a crew who has just spent considerable effort criticizing the Jedi Order for making choices on Anakin's behalf without his knowledge. So what? We leave the chip in. Monroe's disbelief was sharp. Data, that chip gets 100,000 Jedi killed. It gets these clones killed too, eventually, used and discarded the second the war ends. There's no version of leaving it where anyone comes out ahead. I did not say we leave it, Data said. I am suggesting that distinction matters between removing their capacity to be commanded to kill and removing their capacity to choose. The chip, as constructed, does not ask. It compels. If our intervention functions the same way, compelling an outcome, rather than enabling a choice, we have not corrected the injustice. We have merely redirected it toward an end we find more palatable. Anakin looked at Data with something like relief. The particular relief of a child who has been taken seriously by an adult, mid-argument rather than overruled. So build something different. Not a chip that makes them refuse the order. Just take out the compulsion. Leave them able to decide for themselves when the moment comes. That is considerably more difficult, Data acknowledged. It requires isolating the compulsive command architecture from the underlying loyalty and obedience conditioning without disrupting either, a far more delicate operation than blanket removal. I can do delicate, Anakin said, already pulling up a secondary interface, hands moving with the quick, sure confidence of a boy who had spent years coaxing life back into machines other people had given up on. I've been rebuilding half-dead droids since I was 6. This isn't so different. You're not gutting the whole system. You're just finding the one wire that isn't supposed to be there. Monroe watched him work in silence for a long moment, something in her expression shifting from frustration toward a reluctant, complicated respect. You really think 100,000 clone soldiers deserve the chance to make that choice themselves, even knowing what it might cost? I think somebody should have asked me if I wanted to be a slave, Anakin said, not looking up from the terminal. Nobody did. I don't want to do the same thing to them just because it's easier, or because we think we know better. Even if I'd choose right for them every time, that's not the point. The point is it's not mine to choose. Data said nothing, but something in his internal processes registered the moment as data worth preserving beyond its immediate tactical value. A 9-year-old former slave, freshly commissioned, articulating a principle of consent more rigorously than the Jedi Council, in Q's account, would manage to apply to the boy's own life for the next 2 decades. It took 4 hours. Anakin's fingers cramped twice. Monroe fed him ration bars between diagnostic passes without comment. When the last line of isolated code finally decoupled, compulsion severed from loyalty, obedience preserved, choice restored, the terminal chimed softly, and across the vast incubation chambers stretching into Kamino's gray distance, 100,000 sleeping soldiers dreamed on, unaware that somewhere above them, in a maintenance corridor smelling of rain and ozone, 3 strangers had just given them back something Palpatine had never intended them to have. It's done, Anakin said, quiet with exhaustion and something that looked almost like awe at his own hands. They'll still fight. They'll still follow orders. Mostly, that part's not gone. It's just not forced anymore. But when it matters, when somebody tells them to turn their guns on the people they've been fighting beside for years, they'll be able to say no. Data placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture he had observed humans use countless times and rarely employed himself. Reserved now for a moment, he judged worthy of it. Well done, Lieutenant, he said. You have accomplished something the finest engineers in this galaxy did not think to attempt, because they never thought to ask whether these men deserved the choice at all. Outside, the Kamino rain continued its endless fall, and far above the maintenance corridor, The Enterprise Q waited in the storm to carry its small, unlikely crew toward the rot waiting for them at the center of the Republic itself. Coruscant rose beneath the Enterprise Q, like something built rather than grown, an entire planet paved over, with 1,000 years of ambition, its surface lost beneath, spires of glass and durasteel that caught the light of a sun most of its inhabitants had never seen, unfiltered by smog and traffic. It's the seat of the Republic, Data said, as the ship settled into a discreet parking orbit far from the Senate's primary approach lanes, Q having apparently arranged their transponder signature to read as an unremarkable diplomatic shuttle from a system no one would think to question, and, according to Q's account, the seat of Sidious's power as well, hidden in plain sight. In the office of the Republic's newly elected Supreme Chancellor, Shmi had remained aboard with Anakin this time, over the boy's vocal protest. On Data's explicit instruction, Sidious is force-sensitive, in ways that make him considerably more dangerous to detect than a battle droid, network, or a Kaminoan research terminal. Data had told him, if he senses your presence, and Q was clear that your midi-chlorian count is extraordinary enough to draw notice from any sufficiently attuned observer, the entire mission, and quite possibly your safety, would be compromised. That's not fair, Anakin had said. It is not, Data had agreed. It is, however, necessary. I would remind you that the clones' inhibitor chips took 4 hours of your undivided skill to safely disable. This mission requires a different kind of skill, one built on political misdirection, rather than technical precision. I promise you will have ample opportunity to apply your talents again, and soon. So it was Data and Monroe alone who descended into the Senate district's lower levels. Following the coordinates Q's briefing had provided, an unremarkable office suite 3 floors below the Chancellor's public chambers, disguised as a records archive, accessible only through a security protocol that should have taken a skilled hacker the better part of a day to circumvent, and took Data, whose positronic processing speed rendered most Republic-era encryption a matter of seconds rather than hours, considerably less. The archive room, once breached, revealed itself as something far more damning than records. Hollow projectors lined one wall, dormant but recently active communications logs, encrypted beyond standard Republic protocols, routing through relay stations that, when Data cross-referenced their coordinates, corresponded precisely to separatist command centers on Raxus, Geonosis, and a dozen other systems currently listed in official Republic intelligence as neutral or unaligned. He's talking to both sides, Monroe said, reading over Data's shoulder as he pulled records at a speed that would have taken a Republic investigator years to replicate manually. The Chancellor's office is in direct communication with the exact people the Republic is supposedly gearing up to fight. Not merely in communication, Data said, isolating a compressed data packet and running it through translation. Directing this transmission, dated 11 days prior to our arrival, contains explicit instruction to a separatist commander regarding troop deployment schedules that align precisely with the Republic. Military buildup Senator Amidala herself has been publicly opposing. On the Senate floor, Sidious is not merely aware of the coming war. He is choreographing both sides of it, ensuring neither achieves decisive victory, prolonging the conflict for exactly as long as it takes to justify whatever emergency powers he intends to request. Monroe stared at the scrolling Data, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. Not the shock of discovering the conspiracy, which Q had already described in exhausting detail, but the visceral weight of seeing it laid bare in the man's own handwriting, so to speak, methodical and patient and utterly without conscience. There's more, Data said quietly, and something in his tone made Monroe look up. A secondary file, personnel notes, coded under a designation I do not recognize from Q's briefing. Skywalker, contingency. The file, once decrypted, contained a partial dossier, genetic scans of Anakin from a database entry that predated their own arrival on Tatooine by months, cross-referenced against a prophecy text labeled only as the Chosen One, and a series of notes in a private cipher that even Data's processing required several minutes to break. He already knew about Anakin, Monroe said slowly, reading over the translated fragment. Before we ever got there, he was already planning to find him. It appears our intervention did not create this thread of the conspiracy, Data said. It merely accelerated our awareness of it. Sidious was, in the original timeline, going to identify Anakin as a potential asset regardless of our actions, likely through Jedi channels, given the boy's exceptional Force potential, would eventually have drawn the Order's attention, regardless of who found him first. Our removal of Anakin from Tatooine's public awareness may, in fact, be the single most significant divergence in this entire operation. Sidious's contingency file references a boy he has not yet located. We have already found him first. Monroe felt the weight of that settle over her, the understanding that every choice they'd made since waking on this strange ship had been, in its way, a direct countermove against a man who did not yet know he was being played against. Then he doesn't know we exist. He does not, Data confirmed, which grants us an advantage I do not intend to waste. However, Commander, I would draw your attention to one further detail. He isolated a final fragment of the file, a note appended in the same private cipher, dated only 3 days prior. Sidious has become aware of unusual disturbances in the Force, an anomaly he cannot source, coinciding, by his own timestamp, with the Naboo blockade's unexpected collapse and the survival of a Jedi Master he expected dead. He does not know what caused it, but he is looking. The archive room felt suddenly colder, the weight of the galaxy's most dangerous man turning his attention, however blindly, toward the ripples their small crew had already left across his careful design. Then we need to move faster than he can find us, Monroe said. Agreed, Data said, already copying the full archive to a secure data core for later analysis. We have disrupted his timeline in ways he cannot yet explain. That advantage will not last indefinitely. Sidious did not build a decade-long conspiracy by remaining ignorant for long. Behind them, the archive's dormant hollow projectors flickered once, unprompted, and went still again, a small, meaningless malfunction, in all likelihood. But Data logged the anomaly regardless, filing it away beside every other fragment of data that might, in time, prove the difference between victory and catastrophe. They returned to the ship in silence, the weight of the archives, contents settling over both officers, like the Coruscant smog they'd left behind. Hugh was waiting on the bridge when they arrived, not lounging this time, but standing at the viewport, watching the planet's endless lights with an expression that, for once, held nothing performative in it. You found the contingency file, Hugh said, without turning. I wondered how long that would take. You knew it was there, Monroe said. It wasn't a question. I know everything that's there. That's rather the curse of omniscience. Very little surprises me anymore, which is why I find you three so refreshing. Hugh turned, and his eyes moved to Data with something almost like approval. Sidious is looking for the source of his disturbed calculations. He hasn't found it yet, but he will, eventually, because you didn't come here to hide forever. You came here to fight. Then we should prepare accordingly, Data said. The Naboo blockade's collapse, Kagan Jinn's survival, and now the clone army's altered conditioning represent three significant deviations from the timeline you described. Sidious's plans for war remain largely intact, but the pieces he intended to move without resistance are no longer entirely under his control. Good, Hugh said. That was rather the point of giving you a starship instead of a strongly worded letter. He glanced toward the corridor, where Anakin and Shmi had just arrived, drawn by the change in the ship's energy. Which brings me to the matter of permanence. Anakin's expression sharpened with immediate suspicion. What do you mean, permanence? I mean, Hugh said, that this ship does not belong in the galaxy it came from, and neither, any longer, do the two officers who used to serve aboard a rather more famous vessel with a similar name. Data. Monroe, your deaths were real. In your own universe. What I have given you is not resurrection, in the sense of returning you to your old lives. It is a second existence entirely, bound now to this galaxy and no other. The Enterprise Q does not go home. It stays here. Forever. The bridge went quiet. Monroe felt something in her chest tighten. Not fear. Exactly. But the particular grief of a door closing on a life. She had only just begun to properly mourn. You could have told us that at the beginning, she said. I could have, Q agreed. But you would have said yes anyway. And I find honesty is so much more interesting. Once someone has already committed to the bit. His voice softened, fractionally, into something that might almost have been sincerity. You have a boy who will either save this galaxy or unmake it. A mother who has already given up everything wants to protect him. And a crew of 2 who died doing their duty and have been given the singular, absurd privilege of doing it again. On a scale most beings never dream of. I am not asking you to accept a punishment, Commander. I am telling you that you've already built something worth staying for. Data looked to Monroe, and something passed between them, the unspoken understanding of 2 officers, who had each, in their own way, already made peace with endings, and had been given, against all reasonable expectation, a beginning instead. I accept, Data said. So do I, Monroe said, quieter, but no less certain. Q's smile returned, wide and genuine. Then it's settled. The Enterprise Q is yours, Captain, permanently, irrevocably, and with my personal guarantee that it will never again see the inside of whatever quadrant you 2 used to call home. You'll need a crew, eventually. People you trust, gathered from across this galaxy. Because I don't do middle management. And I'm certainly not staffing your quartermaster's office. He glanced at Anakin. You'll need allies among the Jedi too. In time, though I'd wager Master Jin is already halfway to trusting you after. You saved his life twice in 1 week. What happens now? Shmi asked, her arm around her son, watching the strange and impossible family Q had assembled out of grief and second chances. Now, Q said, already beginning to fade at the edges. The particular shimmer that meant. His patience for corporeal form had once again run its course. You go find the rest of your crew. You go finish what you've started on Naboo and Kamino. And somewhere out there, a Sith Lord who thinks he's already won is about to discover that the galaxy he spent 30 years quietly poisoning has just grown a very unexpected immune system. His grin sharpened. One last time. Fight well, Captain. I'll be watching. I always am. And then he was gone, and the bridge of the Enterprise Q held only its small, permanent crew. An android captain twice returned from death. A first officer given a second chance she hadn't asked for and had chosen anyway. A mother finally free of Tatooine's sand. And a boy who had been told, for the very first time in his life, that his choices belonged entirely to him. Below them, Coruscant's lights burned on, indifferent to the war already being quietly unmade in its shadow. Ahead lay Naboo's fragile peace, Kamino's freed soldiers, and a Sith Lord who did not yet know his galaxy had stopped playing by his rules. The ship that would never go home turned its bow toward whatever came next, and did not look back. Against all odds, a crew that should never have existed stood as proof that even in a galaxy bound by the Force, something from beyond could change everything. Q had given them a ship, a mission, and each other, and in the shadows of Coruscant, a Sith Lord was only just beginning to sense that the future he had so carefully engineered no longer belonged entirely to him. The war was still coming, but it would not arrive unopposed.